Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Fairly on in his short essay, Plain Persons and Moral Philosophy, Alasdair MacIntyre is going to highlight what he is going to call two closely related distinctions. And he takes these as being centrally important for moral development, evaluation of ourselves, the narratives that comprise our lives, and are making progress towards not only answering, but pursuing the answer of this question, what is my good? MacIntyre takes this as being central to any sort of, well thought out ethics. It's particularly central in what he's calling Aristotelian or Thomistic virtue ethics, but we can find it in most others as well. The question, what is it that would be good for me? What is good for me as a human being? What does my life center around? What goods should I prioritize? And he's telling us a little bit earlier in this essay that one way in which we make sense of this is what Thomas Aquinas and others would call inclinationes, right? That's often translated just as inclinations. And he tells us that, here it is, these normed, governed directednesses are what Aquinas calls inclinationes. And so, part of it is affective, part of it can also be cognitive, but we are directed towards certain things. We don't need to go into any great detail about that. You can check out Thomas Aquinas, and there's many discussions of that in MacIntyre. So inclinationes are one way in which we grasp this. Another is what he calls practices, and this is really a central concept in MacIntyre's philosophy. And he says that this is a way in which individuals raise or have raised the question, what is my good? A manner that's complementary to that in which the question is posed by inclinationes. And so he calls this a type of activity characteristic of practices. What are these? Cooperative forms of activity whose participants jointly pursue goods internal to these forms of activity and jointly value excellence in achieving these goods. So not every single thing that we do is a practice. There have to be internal goods to it. He gives you examples. The activities of members of string quartets, right? They're getting together to play some music. They're not just BSing or playing role-playing games or canning vegetables. They're actually doing this thing here, which then has its own standards for what comprises excellence. Playing the music well, being able to be in the same tempo with the other people that you're practicing and then eventually performing with. He gives other examples: crews of fishing fleets, architects and construction workers jointly engaged in developing good housing, members of families making and sustaining the familial community, farmers and physicists. These are all, as he says, practice-based and practice-structured. So again, lots of other things to say about practices, but we're mainly just setting the scene here for these distinctions. So MacIntyre goes on a little bit further, and he says that it's by our finding application for a teleological scheme, a goal-directed scheme of understanding in our practical activities, a scheme which provides the directedness of our inclinationes with a further rationale, that we first become evidently, even if unwittingly, Aristotelians. It is doing so, we acquire a capacity for becoming reflective about norms and goals. Now, this doesn't have to be by reading Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle. You could have never read a philosophy book in your life and yet develop this capacity for being reflective about norms and goals. To take the string quartet, if somebody is playing too loudly, you can be, what are you doing, buddy? And they can be like, well, I just want to make sure that I'm actually being heard. And you can be like, so here's the way a string quartet works. We all get our times to be heard, but we're supposed to, work together on this. And then they can say, oh, I didn't realize that was what the goal really was. I mean, I do still have the goal of being heard. Actually, I understand now all of you do too. But here's the way in which we do it according to these norms internal to the practice, right? So we develop these capacities for figuring out how to answer this question concretely, practically, within groups and communities. And then MacIntyre says, well, this leads us to two important interrelated moral distinctions. And again, something that I think we can find at many points in his other work. This is a great article for introducing some key MacIntyrean ideas. So he says, the first of these distinctions is that between what I would do if I did what would please me most here and now. And now, please doesn't necessarily mean, physical pleasure. It's what I would actually enjoy the most here and now, what I would value the most here and now. And then, on the other side, what I would do if, now notice this proviso, in the light of the best instruction available to me, I were to do what would make me excellent in the pursuit of the goods internal to the particular practice or practices in which I'm engaged. Now, why do we have to make that distinction? A lot of people don't. And they think that, if I just do what I enjoy here and now, what I find most interesting, compelling, attractive, then that will result in me being excellent. So you get a lot of amateur musicians who never get any good because they're not willing to put in the time, the discipline, the work of doing all the practice stuff to build up their skills, and they just want to play songs, and they never actually progress towards those goods internal to those practices, right? And we could come up with all sorts of other distinctions. He mentioned family life, right? It's quite easy if you're a parent to say, I just want us all to get along and I want to be friends with my kids. But that's not what all parenting is. I mean, ideally, you do actually have friendships with your children, but that has to develop over time. And, in light of the best information that I have, you could say, well, what would actually make me excellent in pursuit of the goods internal to the practices? Those goods might be providing for your children's own development and health and other things well. And so in order to be excellent as a parent that way, you have to, you can't just do what would please you here and now. I mean, we could think about very simple things like, should you cook food at home that's healthy and where you know where the ingredients are coming from, or should you always just order in? I mean, it's easier to order in, not cheaper to order in, but there's some excellences that come from the practices of cooking, not just for yourself, but for others as well. So now he says failure in making this first distinction is characteristically a sign of failure in a determinate field, in ordering the appetites and passions. So the appetites are desires. He's using a sort of Aristotelian Thomistic terminology there. Think about your desires, your things that you're also averse to, and then the passions. The passions are the emotions, right? So MacIntyre is using a slightly archaic vocabulary here. not making this distinction well is a sort of failure in becoming excellent in a number of ways. So, a prerequisite to that is learning how to control your appetites and not respond emotionally all the time, to call your emotional responses into question. And it doesn't mean you have to turn your emotions off or anything like that. Then he says the second distinction. This is very interesting. Now, it's a little bit hard to read this. MacIntyre, sometimes his style gets confusing between what it would be to achieve what is good and best unqualifiedly. We'll come back to that in a moment. And what is good and best here and now for me at my stage in the education of my capacities to do. So what is he saying there? What it would be to achieve what is good and best unqualifiedly. What is the ideal limit point or end or goal, not just for me, but for anybody else who's in my sort of situation, broadly speaking. So again, let's take musical performance. What would it be for me as a musician, I'm an amateur musician, to realize my good, to achieve what is good and best unqualifiedly? I can project what it would be like for me, and it would take a very long time for me to reach that if I could indeed do it, but I can imagine that for myself, right? And I can imagine that for myself as a parent, just to use some of the other examples. I don't farm, but I have had gardens, and I could imagine what that would be like for me as somebody who engages with a plot of land over time, cares for it, harvests it, weeds it, all those sorts of things. So that's one thing over here. Now, we can also say, what is it that is good and best here and now for me at my stage of education or moral development? What would be good and best for me to do? And so this is a very important distinction, and some people blur these together and get them quite confused. They think that you don't, need any sort of ideal like this to give you a sense of where you could be going. I'm just going to focus on what's good and best for me right now. I'm very pragmatic. Or they can go the other way, and they can be like, if I can't achieve this, then this other stuff over here is just crap. It's not good. It's not best because it's not the best or the highest good, and therefore it's valueless. But MacIntyre wants to say, no. How you actually develop this capacity for becoming reflective about your norms and goals better and better and better is by making this distinction, by holding these two different things in mind at the same time. And he says that when you fail at this, it's characteristically a sign of failure in evaluating how far I've progressed in ordering these appetites and passions. So both distinctions are actually dealing with appetites and passions, or we could say desires and aversions and emotions, right? And how we understand, how we deal with them. But they're doing it in somewhat different ways. And MacIntyre brings this to a close by saying how to make these distinctions is something each person has to learn. And what has to be learned can always be mislearned. We can get these distinctions wrong because maybe other people or our culture gives us the wrong take on these. So he says through a process of learning, making mistakes, correcting these mistakes, moving towards the achievement of excellence, the individual comes to understand themselves as in via, meaning on the road, in the middle of a journey. Right? So these are distinctions that inevitably MacIntyre thinks everybody either makes or they screw up and either make badly or don't make at all, but you can't really get away from them. So this is why he wants to highlight them here in this essay.